Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. I'm Mary Barrell. Recently, there have been many reports about alarming challenges facing the nonprofit sector, including unprecedented demand for services, falling donations, and staff burnout. Other reports point to donors' economic situations and larger sociological shifts for the downward trend in donations. We're taking the pulse of fundraising for nonprofits in 2024 and looking ahead to major trends that will impact the sector in the future. Joining me to discuss these important issues and her research is Dr. Paloma Raggo of Carleton University's Charity Insights Canada Project, or CICP. Dr. Raggo is a faculty in the faculty of the graduate programs of philanthropy and nonprofit leadership at the School of Public Policy and Administration at Carleton University. Her research and teaching focuses on leadership and nonprofit governance, global philanthropy, and research methods. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Mary. I'm glad to be here.
What kind of data is generally available about the Canadian nonprofit sector? Is there a gap in data impacting our sector today?
It's interesting because a lot of people assume we don't have a lot of information about the sector, but there is lots of information out there. One of the big challenge we have is either the quality is uneven or the access is problematic. The government publishes a lot of information. It's just not in a format that's consumable. Imagine Canada produces a lot of the reports, and these are often based on, sector-wide perspective. So there is a lot of good information out there. It's just sometimes not easily accessible or not as current as we would like it to be. If you think about government data, the T3010 forms and the tax data that they release are usually 18 months old by the time we have public access to it. So what we can infer from it is relatively limited.
Yes, and StatsCan reports often come back, much, much later, of course, reporting on past periods. Can you tell us about the CICP and how it got started and what its purpose is?
Yes. So it got really started as a response from a call from the Mutar Foundation and some of our donors who uh, needed, especially during COVID, we really saw this happening. We needed clear, timely, fast answers to issues that were coming up. But having data that's 18 months old in the middle of a pandemic is not as helpful as we would like it to be. So the question was, how can we make this happen? How could we have almost near real time data about the sector, concerns, trends? And we proposed a project which got funded. And the idea was that each week we would ask a panel of about 1,000 charities across Canada, selected randomly, so to ensure that it represents as well the Canadian population of charities. And we would ask them weekly questions. So short pulse survey. And on the Wednesday, we ask them questions. On the Friday, we deliver the results. And we've been doing this now for a year and a half. And with this year, we started off year two with over 80% response rate. So we are able to recruit them. And on top of that, they are participating and engaging because I think it's interesting for them to know what other charities think. So we're breaking this isolation as well, because many are in the same boat.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a quick turnaround. How can individuals and organizations use the data that's being published to further their work?
Yeah, so the question was, okay, so if we have lots of information, why collect more information? And, having helpful, near time, really recent data is helpful. But I think in the bigger picture, it's helpful because when you're struggling with some issues, you face some challenges, organizations tend to operate in silos and are not necessarily well connected to the trends in their own field. We rely a lot on our intuitions or what we hear around our tables, but what about the rest of the country? What about a different region? And so part of the goal is to give organizations, whether they're small, larger, a narrative also, and for them to help carve compelling arguments for support towards whether it's their potential donors, fundraising, make the case that they need, because oftentimes they'll face similar response: show me the data. Like, how do I know what you're telling me is just not what you think the challenge is? And here we're providing verified, like assessed, rigorous data on the issues that matter at the moment.
So they can access this online via reports or collated sort of data that they can, avail themselves as.
Yes. So right now, so the project, is a young project. We're starting our second year, so we've been operational for the public for the last year and a half. So on our website, if you go to carleton.ca/CICP dash PCPub, which is the acronym in French, you have access to the data. So what we did, and we're trying to reorganize, and we're creating a database so people can search, but we've organized into themes. So for each themes, people can go and download the report, which gives the descriptive data for every questions we've asked. So right away, they have access to that each week. We're currently working on dashboards, so we're harnessing a bit the power of big data, Power BI, and all these instruments. So people in a few months will be able to go on our website and then do very simple analyses or comparison. Okay, how about small organizations? What do they think about this? So people can kind of create a profile and filter the data we've gathered based on what they're interested in. So whether they're organization, whether they're practitioners, fundraisers, they'll be able to look at various profiles such as the age of the organizations, the region, the size, whether they're urban or rural, different, whether they have employees, all volunteer run. So lots of subsequent data is coming and the ability to play with it. But for now, for every week, we have the descriptive data. And if people have specific needs, they can always contact us. We're a small team, so we're trying to answer all the data queries we can. But as soon as we have the dashboards available, it's going to be much easier for people to really play with that. We also have on the website a community education center, because part of the challenge with all these data questions, everyone's like, data's so important. Data's the new gold rush. Everyone wants it. Everyone's trying to find it somewhere. But there's little effort done around data literacy, and that's a real commitment we have. Whereas you can have the best data in the world, if you don't know how to manage it, access it, interpret it, how much good can it do for you and for others? So what we're trying to build is really these basic skills around data literacy. And when I say basic, we're not talking about university level. We're really talking about basic, because some people, that's what they need to really understand what's happening. What is data? What is a variable? What can I do with the kind of information I actually have? And so we're building these capacity building for practitioners, for fundraisers, and hopefully for the general public. They better understand the work the sector does.
Well, it sounds like a fascinating and practical and useful project. I'm very excited about learning more about it. Let's dig into some of the actual data that you've been able to publish. What overall picture is emerging in terms of organizations' capacity to successfully fundraise? What should fundraisers be paying attention to right now?
So what's interesting is that fundraising, so the pandemic has had a clear effect on fundraising trends. One of the biggest result of the pandemic was really the near full stop of in-person events. And we're not back yet to pre-pandemic events, because I think part of it is a shift in people's behaviors. Now, this online life, activities, events has taken a life of its own. People are more comfortable with it. Organizations realize also there's a lot of savings that can be done. There are new costs, but there's also a lot of economies of scale, particularly if you want to have people from bigger pools and bigger regions. So online events are not as uh, physical events are not the priority as pre-pandemic they were. So we haven't gone back to pre-pandemic level, but one thing that we have noticed is when we ask them about changes and priority changes, we see that fundraising, particularly in relations with EDI and equity and diversity initiatives, comes last. This is the area sometimes organizations don't necessarily focus right away, whether it's because they're set on their ways or donors have shifting priorities. And we have seen in the past years, especially since the pandemic, the past 3 years, that concerns around equity, diversity, and justice have really taken center stage on the kind of issues, programs, and focus organizations have. And our data shows some of this. Um, Another thing that I think plays into this is in terms of developing relationship with donors. This has become much more important to ensure some kind of stability. The pandemic has shown how volatile the context can be. From one day to the other, your activities are shut down, and if your base is not solid, you're not able to weather the storm. And now, being in a post-pandemic, with the caveat that the pandemic is actually not done, but in a post-pandemic world, um, people, organizations, fundraisers are realizing that this relationship building is much more important than the actual fundraising strategies. And so it's a shift from strategy focus, what can I do, to relationship building. Okay, how can I bring in committed people to the organization? And that shift has been quite interesting since the pandemic.
Very interesting. Now, I understand that you devote a weekly survey, and you did so in June 2023, that is committed and dedicated to understanding donor behavior. Can you give us some of the key insights from that survey?
Yeah. So one thing that we were asking in general was about. So we asked a couple of surveys actually about donors and the types of financing also they do. One of the questions we asked, and I let me check if it was before June, we asked in January initially at the beginning of last year's study, how diverse the funding sources were. Because we were curious, there is this narrative in Canada that most of the funding comes from the governments, but we're hearing a lot of talk about the importance of building relationship with donors. So we're interested to really understand where does your revenue funding come from, and our data shows that about 73% of the charities that responded noted that government grants are their biggest source of revenues. But close behind is fundraising from the public. So we're talking about 70% of the charities rely on some form. They rely on government grants, but also rely on fundraising from the public. So this idea that the sector is predominantly government dependent has some truth to it, but we should not discount the importance of involving the general public um, in that relationship. So in June, let me just pull the June report here because I have it handy. So some of the questions we asked. So for example, we asked. How would you describe the levels of giving to your organization in the last years? Here, the goal was to really understand whether since 2020 donors have been more engaged, less engaged. And so we find that about 11% of our panel responded that given has significantly decreased. And to the opposite end, 7% said it has significantly increased. So really the le nerf de la guerre, we say in French, so the story is really in the middle. So what's happening there? And we find that about 29%, 30% have said that the donors' level of giving has remained relatively stable in the last years. So we are not necessarily seeing the apocalyptic call that we saw early in the pandemic. It's saying, a lot of organizations will collapse. It's going to be really, really bad. I think part of it is the swift reaction by the government and foundations around that time, creating emergency funds and supporting immediate needs. It was part of a lucky kind of bet. One of the big challenges, actually, that some organizations and foundations, we participated in another study with Philanthropic Foundations Canada and my colleague Susan Phillips, where we found that some organizations had a big influx of funds but didn't necessarily have the full capacity to manage that fund. So we have to be careful sometimes. You're really successful, be ready to be really successful, especially in the sphere of fundraising. You could be victim of your own success. But so we found that it remained really relatively stable. Some moderately increased, some slightly decreased. But overall, we're not seeing the doom and gloom scenario that was predicted at the beginning of the pandemic. But again, what we're seeing is a shift between the focus on strategy. How do I get the money to how do I keep the money and keep people engaged and donors engaged? So it's really this shift between strategy and relationship. Later on, later on we asked if donor attitudes in general have changed towards the organization. A lot of people, the narrative and a prevalent narrative is that now donors are leading the conversations. They want to see specific things happening in the organizations, and there's some pushbacks to that. People are arguing for the communities to have greater agency in these decisions, what donations can do and where they should go. So we asked them, the question was exactly, how have donor attitudes changed in recent years towards your organization? And what we found was really 25% of our respondents have observed a shift in donors' priorities towards specific causes and specific issues. So they are hearing that donors have narrowed, focused maybe their interests, which is good in a way if you're already in that field. It can be a challenge if you're not around these areas and requires much more agility from organizations. So I think now we're kind of in the second phase of post-pandemic. And I think this is where we're really going to see the strain, maybe not the doom and gloom predicted initially, but if organizations don't have this agility built in or not working towards that, then this transition might be more difficult to keep building these relationships and not necessarily focus on how do I get pre-pandemic we're in a post-pandemic world. Just forget how you were operating pre-pandemic. Change is coming.
Right. So we can't go back there. I guess uh, that is an interesting observation for sure, given that your mid-year report for 2023 indicated that the sector is raising fewer funds than before the pandemic. Can you expand on this, and what do you think is contributing to this decline?
But I think there's more competition around, interest have perhaps coalesced around broader issues, the issues of diversity, uh, housing, and there are specific fields that people have kind of gravitated towards. So I think overall, uh, the economy, inflations, demographic shifts have all contributed in a different way of giving. But I think the way we're measuring giving, if we're only focusing on dollars, we might, yeah, see some declines in specific areas. But it's not clear if what we're observing is a shift in trends in a narrowing and condensing of priorities, or what we're observing is this generational shift where people want to be giving their time, their talent, volunteering in different ways online. And so I think it's really going back to our definitions. At the end of the day, organizations need funds to operate. So, of course, we need to focus on that. But overall, I just think that post pandemic, we had this increase, the government support, and now people are trying to find their footings and saying, okay, this is not there anymore. So, how do we cycle in people that remain committed? And I think that's this transition at phase two post pandemic that we're seeing and embarking in, really.
And the report also identifies what you call a paradox, that while many organizations are struggling to raise funds at the pre pandemic level, 1/5 are still expecting to see improvements in the near future. Canada Helps, in their 2023 giving report, also highlighted this disparity, which caused them to question when optimism can be unhealthy for the sector. How do you reconcile this decline in fundraising effectiveness with an optimistic future outlook? Is this optimism dangerous for the sector? Should they be responding in a more sort of proactive way to try and find solutions?
That's a good question. Is too much optimism a bad thing? I think, um, it, in other words, should the sector be more realistic of what's happening? And I think as long as we have new data coming in and kind of showing these perceptions and the effect of these perceptions, we might be able to mitigate. I think what it tells me when I look at optimism, it gives me hope in a sense that people are still willing to look forward, plan, innovate. One of the big drawbacks is this inertia where they're not realizing that innovation requires capacity building investments, and not so much from the organizations themselves, but from funders. In order to change and in order to keep growing, organizations need to take risks. Funders need to take risks, and sometimes they're very risk averse. And so I'm personally a very optimistic person, so I always will say, oh, optimism is great, but grounded in reality, a lot of people are perhaps missing a bit some of the challenges on the ground of this shifting in technology. Now we're dealing with a sector that is really seeing the effects of AI, what it can do, but how it can affect also the labor, the intellectual property, and all these kind of ethical challenges and biases. Are we prepared for these kinds of technological transitions and the costs associated to that? I'm not sure. I'm not sure that funders are also really aware that transitioning takes support. and making a case for that is challenging. And hopefully our data helps in that way.
Well, let's shift the conversation a little bit to the insight your surveys have provided on equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives in the sector. What have your surveys shown about representation in the sector, especially with boards and senior staff and leaders as it relates to diversity?
It's super interesting because there has been, not, I want to say pushback, but there has been some interesting reactions to some of the data we've collected. So just recently, we had a survey asking about gender representations, the role of women in boards, and we find that in senior management levels, at least from the charities that responded to our surveys this year, 76% estimate that it's woman led. How people define women, we left it to our respondent. We just talked about gender diversity and asking about women representation. And it's interesting because there's a really strong narrative that positions in senior leaderships are male dominated and the front staff and the rest of the workers are more female because you know the charity sector, the nonprofit sector as a whole, is a very gendered sector. We know that it mostly employs, hire women, but there's this really, top level positions are still more male dominated, etc. And that's not what we're finding. And so, is that surprising? Is that we stand by our data? We think that the data is representative, at least of the people that are replying. But why would that be the case? And I think we have other data talking about the amount of unpaid labor, the working conditions in the sector, and it's a tough sector to work in. It's a sector that asks a lot of its staff. We're finding results about unpaid labor, like how many hours are people working over what they're paying. So we're not talking about volunteering where you volunteer. It's more voluntold. You need to work these hours on top of what, and part of the answers of why so many women, it's a tough sector to work in. The conditions are not always as glamorous as we would, deserve them to be for people that kind of work. And so oftentimes we see that people historically marginalized, underserved, tend to have these, position these kinds of work because more sometimes lucrative aspects. So we're talking about for profits or non registered charities, other areas will be more gendered, but in a different balance. And so we thought this was interesting. Uh, we found also that people felt that representation in general was not as bad as the narrative oftentimes is, but there are some areas of much needed progress, particularly around LGBTQ representation, around immigrants, around visible minorities or other groups. But the sector is making progress. And I think that's really the important thing here to note. More progress is needed, but we're seeing from the data that it's actually moving in the right direction.
So I'd like to turn a little bit more to I guess, the last groups that you've mentioned, 2S LGBTQ plus individuals, Indigenous people, Black people, other people of color, disabled people. I'm curious whether your questions addressed those folks and just whether or not they were in leadership roles, whether it be on the board or in senior executive roles.
Yeah, so we asked a question, and one of the weeks we asked, particularly at each level of the organizations, the kind of diversity people see, and we talk about different types of diversity as well, and we're seeing much more in the front lines. that the composition varies much more than as you go up in the organizations. And I think it speaks to internal mechanism to make sure that people can go up in organization and not only lateral moves at the entry level. So organizations need to reflect within them themselves. Is there a way to continue this diversification, not just at the entry staff level? But we need to keep in mind that most of the sector, and our data shows that, we have a lot of micro-organization. And by micro-organization, we're talking about organizations that have extremely small budget, more likely to be run by exclusively volunteers, have no full-time paid staff or part-time staff. So in these organizations, sometimes diversity is also a challenge, a practical challenge, is because there is part of the labor of diversifying that always falls on the same groups of people as well. And so at some point, we need to find various ways in which organizations can diversify, not just having a checklist of, oh, do I have a person from that background, a person from that background? So not only focus on the demographics, because then you really increase the labor and the invisible labor on particular communities. So emphasis on skills, emphasis on other aspects is also important. So we tend to focus on what we can measure. So, we can check these, but there is some progress made. We just have to be careful that we don't fall in the trap of, okay, I need 2 person from this, 3 person from that background. So yeah, so that's a challenge, particularly for small organizations.
Yeah, I think you're referring to tokenism and it's the performative sort of EDI sort of initiatives. What in your mind when you say supports? What do you think that means? What can we do to more effectively offer supports to organizations to be able to further the EDI initiatives and diversify their leadership and their staff more effectively?
So I think the number one, and so I've done some work, well, here with the CICP, but also outside the CICP, some research on challenges around diversity. And oftentimes the onus is put on, okay, organizations need to develop initiatives so that they can attract more diverse people, staff, stakeholders, and so the organization's more diverse. But I think we're looking at it maybe the wrong way. The culture needs to change. The question is more, why are diverse people on all kinds of dimension not attracted to particular sectors, organizations? And I think there's a lot of culture shift that needs to happen. Having people in your boards, in your organizations that challenge established practice is not comfortable. I know personally, I go on a board, I tend to be the troublemaker, or hey, have you thought about this? How can we change this? Decision making, involvement. It's not easy and it's not comfortable. And a lot of organizations, I'm afraid, are not ready to change the deep culture of understanding really that it's the problem is not that people don't want to be involved. It's the problem that they're perhaps unconsciously repelling people. Like, I don't want to be involved with them. And a lot of self evaluation needs to happen before you put in any initiatives you want. Why can't we retain the people? That's the real question here.
Well, I'd like to wrap up our interview by asking you whether you could provide us some information about how our listeners can get more involved and stay in touch with CICP and the important publications and data that you are publishing.
Fantastic. First and foremost, come to a website, look at the information, send us an email, subscribe to our newsletter. If you go on carleton.ca/CICP dash, yes, dash, dash PC Pub, right on the homepage, you can subscribe to the newsletter. Every week, we send a quick recap of what we've asked in the week, what we found. So that's the really quickest, easiest. Once a month, we're launching these conversations around what we've asked. So, where someone in our team will briefly, 15 minutes, show these are the questions we asked and let's talk about it. Our next one will be on March, I can tell you, uh, on March 20th. So it's coming up. And so we'll have them once a month. And to know when they're coming, to register, you can find all the information. And so these will be a great occasion to come over lunch for an hour, if over lunch if you're in the East Coast, uh, first thing in the morning if you're on the West Coast, and come and discuss, why do you think we're finding what we're finding? Do you agree? Do you disagree? What should we be asking? We asked the wrong thing. We should be asking that. Come and tell us. We're really open, and we really want to get everyone, whether it's practitioners, the general public, other academics, involved in the discussion. That's really the goal, is that people know about the sector, know what's happening right now, and just start conversations. And hopefully, by emailing us, subscribing to our newsletter, or even attending these conversations, people will get more engaged and send us your ideas. We're curious.
Well, I want to thank you for this fascinating discussion. The data that CICP is providing in virtually real time, so very useful to the sector, and the published reports that emerge from that important data. Our discussion and all of your insights and expertise will be so appreciated by our podcast audience. Thank you for joining Charity Village Connects.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and thanks for spreading the words and supporting our efforts.
Well, it's our pleasure. So glad to see that CICP is so connected and engaged in trying to reach out across Canada of all of the various nonprofits and charities in Canada. So thank you for that work.
Great, thanks.